January 17, 1945. The eastern sky hung heavy with gray clouds over a snow-laden field in northern Germany. Frost clung to the edges of abandoned vehicles, and the distant rumble of artillery echoed faintly across the frozen landscape. Colonel Wilhelm Richter trudged through the mud and ice, his breath visible in the cold morning air, his boots crunching over broken crates and discarded equipment. Ahead, a strange gleam caught his eye. Rows of barrels, neatly stacked, their labels marked U.S. fuel. He stopped, disbelief etching his face. 50,000 gallons, more than an entire division could consume in a week. The sheer abundance contrasted sharply with the empty reserves he had come to accept as normal. Soldiers scuttled nearby, faces grim, eyes hollow from months of retreat and failed operations. Richter felt a strange knot in his stomach, a mixture of relief and dread. Relief at the unexpected supply, but dread because the sight confirmed a brutal truth. The Wehrmacht could not sustain itself. No strategy, no courage, no desperation could replace what Germany lacked most: fuel. In that frozen field, surrounded by the smell of gasoline and the silence of the dying war, the end became undeniable. By early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final, bitter months. Germany, once a continent-spanning force, was now cornered on all fronts. In the east, the Red Army advanced relentlessly through Poland, pushing toward the Oder River and the heart of the Reich itself. In the west, American, British, and Canadian forces had crossed the Rhine, breaking through what remained of Hitler's defensive lines. The Wehrmacht, stretched thin across thousands of kilometers of territory, faced shortages that went beyond men and ammunition. Fuel, the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, had become Germany's most critical vulnerability. Tanks sat idle, trucks and ambulances ran dry, and sat down. Tire divisions ground to a halt while the Allies poured oil, gasoline, and diesel into their own war machine. The disparity was stark, and those on the ground knew it. Supply depots had been destroyed in relentless Allied bombing campaigns. Rail networks lay in ruins, bridges collapsed, and roads clogged with abandoned vehicles. Even when fuel existed somewhere in the rear, getting it to the front lines was often impossible. The United States, fully mobilized by 1944, produced petroleum in quantities Germany could only dream of. American refineries in Texas, Louisiana, and Pennsylvania fed convoys across the Atlantic, where tanker ships braved U-boats and mines to deliver millions of gallons of fuel to Europe. The Allies' logistical advantage was unmatched. While German engineers tried to convert coal and synthetic materials into usable fuel, the process was slow, costly, and far from sufficient. Every tank, every truck, every aircraft that remained operational became a precious asset, a fragile thread in a war machine rapidly unraveling. The human cost of these shortages was immediate. German soldiers trained to fight with mechanized support often found themselves marching on foot for dozens of miles in freezing conditions. Supply lines that should have allowed armored divisions to counterattack were too weak to move even basic necessities. Generals argued over priorities: fuel for the Eastern Front or fuel for the Ardennes, for the Luftwaffe or for panzer divisions. Every choice was a compromise, and every compromise brought strategic failure closer. The morale of men who saw vehicles abandoned by the roadside, engines cold and useless, deteriorated rapidly. Stories of entire columns immobilized for lack of gasoline became common. Soldiers no longer worried only about bullets or artillery, they worried about whether they could even move. On the Allied side, the situation was almost the opposite. Logistics had become a weapon of war, perhaps the most decisive one. The U.S. Army's Red Ball Express, a network of trucks ferrying supplies from ports in France to the front lines, operated day and night. Every convoy delivered fuel, ammunition, and food with near-perfect efficiency. Allied commanders could plan operations knowing that their units would have the resources to execute them. Tanks rolled forward in waves, aircraft soared in continuous air superiority patrols, and mechanized infantry could exploit weaknesses instantly. For Germany, this was a nightmare. Any successful tactical maneuver required fuel that often simply did not exist. Even when raw courage and experience allowed German forces to mount local counterattacks, these successes were fleeting, unsustainable, and unable to change the overall course of the war. It was into this context that Colonel Richter and his men had been deployed. Operating in a landscape that once promised conquest, now scarred by retreat and bombardment, they searched for whatever supplies could be salvaged. Fuel depots, warehouses, and abandoned American convoys became targets, not for glory, but for survival. Every leader captured was a temporary reprieve, a chance to keep vehicles moving and divisions alive, even for a few days. Yet the sheer scale of Allied production made even these windfalls insignificant in the long term. The sight of 50,000 gallons of American fuel in the middle of a devastated German province was at once miraculous and damning. It symbolized everything Germany had lost: initiative, resources, and the power to sustain a war on multiple fronts. The winter of 1945 was brutal. Soldiers faced icy winds and snow-covered roads that slowed movement and sapped strength. Civilians huddled in bombed-out cities, sharing whatever warmth and food they would find. Amid this chaos, German commanders were forced to reconcile their strategic ambitions with harsh realities. Hitler's directives remained grandiose and detached from logistics, insisting on offensives that could no longer be supported. Local commanders, aware of fuel shortages, tried to improvise, but improvisation could not replace industrial production or strategic foresight. The gap between what Germany could do and what it wanted to do widened daily, and every captured Allied supply, no matter how large, highlighted the insufficiency of the Reich's own resources. This reality, this dependence on captured supplies to even contemplate movement, set the stage for a crucial realization. For men like Colonel Richter, it became increasingly clear that Germany's fate was no longer determined by strategy, courage, or leadership alone. It was determined by something more fundamental: the ability to keep machines running, troops supplied, and logistics intact. And in that frozen landscape, surrounded by the smell of gasoline and the remnants of war, the magnitude of what Germany had lost could not be ignored. The German military machine in 1945 depended on a fragile network of synthetic fuel plants, captured oil fields, and dwindling reserves. Before the war, Germany had invested heavily in the production of ersatz fuel, synthetic gasoline, and diesel made from coal. These plants, scattered across the Ruhr Valley and central Germany, could produce thousands of barrels per month, but they were expensive, slow, and vulnerable. Allied bombers knew exactly where to strike. By late 1944, repeated raids had destroyed much of the synthetic fuel infrastructure. The few plants still standing operated at half capacity, constantly threatened by air attacks and sabotage. Every liter produced had to be rationed, allocated to aircraft, tanks, and trucks in a system that increasingly resembled a desperate patchwork rather than a coordinated supply chain. Rail transport, once the backbone of German logistics, had become another liability. Bridges lay in ruins after relentless bombing campaigns, and key junctions had been captured or destroyed by advancing Allied forces. Trucks filled the gaps, but even these were limited by fuel availability. Columns of lorries, laden with essential supplies, often became stationary targets, abandoned when gasoline ran out or engines froze in winter temperatures. A single operational panzer division could be immobilized by a shortage of a few hundred gallons of fuel. Every delay, every halted convoy, amplified the pressure on frontline units. German officers began to understand that even small amounts of captured fuel could temporarily change tactical possibilities, but the larger strategic problem remained unaltered. Meanwhile, Allied logistics had reached a level of efficiency that German commanders could barely comprehend. The Americans in particular had harnessed industrial power to create a flood of fuel and munitions. Ports in Normandy, Antwerp, and Marseille served as hubs for supplies, which were then transported via rail and the Red Ball Express to the front lines. Allied planners considered fuel the ultimate strategic weapon. Every offensive relied on it, and every delay could be absorbed without collapsing operations. Tanks, trucks, and aircraft moved in concert with assured supply lines. Even when encountering stiff resistance, Allied units could exploit weaknesses, knowing that reinforcements and fuel were always available. For Germany, the contrast was staggering. While officers rationed fuel for an entire army, the Allies could keep dozens of armored divisions on continuous operations, sustaining mobility, air support, and artillery firepower without pause. German soldiers and commanders quickly realized the implications. Fuel shortages were not just a logistical inconvenience, they were decisive. During the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, Hitler's plan had depended on fast-moving armored units reaching Antwerp. The fuel simply wasn't there. Panzer columns stalled, vehicles were abandoned in forests and snowfields, and offensive momentum evaporated. The failure was not due to enemy fire alone, but to an inability to maintain mechanized mobility. Infantry marched on frozen roads, relying on dwindling rations, while the mechanized edge of the German army withered. In battles across the eastern and western fronts, the pattern repeated. Operational plans, no matter how brilliant in conception, collapsed when fuel ran out. The Reich's military prowess, once defined by speed and maneuver, became hamstrung by something as basic as gasoline. Even when fuel was captured from the enemy, the benefit was temporary. A depot of 50,000 gallons, for instance, could keep a small force moving for days, maybe a week. But in the grand scheme of operations spanning hundreds of kilometers, it was a drop in a rapidly emptying ocean. Colonels like Wilhelm Richter understood this acutely. Their forces could fight, even achieve local victories, but every gain was fleeting. The captured fuel offered momentary hope, but also revealed a broader truth. Germany no longer controlled its destiny. Its fate was determined not by courage or tactics alone, but by the capacity to supply its forces in an increasingly inhospitable environment. Industrial output, previously a source of strength, now highlighted the imbalance. While German factories produced tanks, aircraft, and artillery, each unit was only as effective as the fuel that powered it. By contrast, American and British industry not only manufactured equipment but ensured that it could operate continuously. The Allies' ability to feed entire armies with fuel created an operational freedom Germany could no longer match. Even elite divisions could not overcome systemic shortages. Commanders were forced to choose between sending units into combat half-equipped or holding them in reserve, knowing that inactivity might be just as deadly as action. By the winter of 1945, this imbalance had transformed from an inconvenience into a strategic collapse. German officers were increasingly aware that no plan, however daring, could compensate for the lack of fuel. Every abandoned tank, every stalled truck, every empty depot underscored a grim reality. The mechanized advantage Germany had once wielded with devastating effect had disappeared. Mobility, once a hallmark of blitzkrieg, became a luxury the Reich could no longer afford. Every captured barrel of Allied fuel was a reminder of how far Germany had fallen and how the Allies had turned logistics into an unstoppable weapon. In this frozen, desperate landscape, surrounded by the remnants of retreating armies and devastated towns, German commanders began to understand the inevitability of defeat. The stage was set for moments of revelation, moments when the scale of the problem could no longer be ignored. And for Colonel Richter, standing among the captured fuel, that moment had arrived, a silent acknowledgement that Germany's defeat was no longer a matter of if, but when. Colonel Richter's discovery of the 50,000 gallons of fuel was more than a logistical event. It was a human moment, a mirror reflecting the collapse of an entire army. For the soldiers around him, morale had been fragile for months. The constant retreat, the bitter winters, and the relentless pressure from both the eastern and western fronts had worn them down. Men who had once charged with panzer divisions now trudged on foot, frostbitten, hungry, and exhausted. The sight of abundant fuel sparked a fleeting sense of hope, a reminder that machines could still move, that vehicles could be revived. Yet within Richter, that hope quickly mingled with dread. He saw what the fuel represented, a temporary reprieve in a war already lost. He understood that no quantity of captured resources could compensate for the systemic collapse of German logistics. The human dimension of warfare was tied inexorably to material realities, and in that moment, the weight of history pressed down. Tactically, the implications were immediate yet limited. A single tank or truck required dozens of gallons just to move a few miles. And while the captured fuel could sustain a small force for a brief period, it could not restore operational freedom to an entire front. Infantry could advance, artillery could fire, and a handful of vehicles could maneuver. But without long-term supply, these efforts were ephemeral. Commanders faced impossible choices. They could launch localized counterattacks using the fuel, temporarily reclaiming villages or roads, but such victories were isolated and ultimately unsustainable. The battlefields of 1945 were not shaped solely by tactics, but by the underlying reality of supply. Fuel shortages dictated the tempo of war, forcing German leaders into reactive measures, unable to dictate the course of engagements as they had in earlier campaigns. From a technological perspective, the discovery highlighted the dependence of Germany's military apparatus on petroleum. Tanks like the Panther and Tiger, impressive engineering feats, demanded enormous amounts of fuel. Trucks, motorcycles, half-tracks, and aircraft were equally dependent, creating a web of vulnerabilities. Even advanced designs, which had once given German forces an edge, became liabilities when they could not be powered. Vehicles were abandoned on snow-covered roads, engines cold, wheels sinking into mud. The Army's mechanized strength, its mobility and shock capability had been neutralized not by superior Allied weaponry alone, but by an inability to operate the machines at all. Technology without fuel was useless, and this realization struck the colonel with stark clarity. Leadership decisions also framed the significance of the captured fuel. Hitler's insistence on maintaining offensive operations, regardless of resources, compounded the crisis. Orders poured down from Berlin demanding attacks, counterattacks, and positional holds, often with no consideration for the availability of gasoline or diesel. Generals and colonels at the front were caught between obedience to the Führer and the reality on the ground. Some attempted to improvise, diverting scarce fuel to critical points, but such decisions carried risk. Misallocation could doom entire units. The captured American fuel revealed the contrast sharply. Allied commanders coordinated operations around available resources, while German leaders constantly fought to stretch what little they had. Strategic brilliance could not overcome material deficiency, and the human cost of poor decisions grew with every stalled column. The enemy perspective was equally instructive. American and British forces understood the leverage fuel provided. Their emphasis on securing ports, maintaining supply convoys, and protecting tanker shipments ensured that mechanized units could operate continuously. Allied operational plans assumed mobility, a factor German units could no longer take for granted. Every captured depot was a small temporary reversal, but the Allies could absorb losses with minimal disruption. For Colonel Richter and his peers, this underscored the imbalance of power. Even a stockpile of 50,000 gallons, significant though it was, could not match the scale of Allied production or the precision of their logistics. In the calculus of war, the quantity was dwarfed by the quality and consistency of supply behind enemy lines. The moral and psychological angle cannot be overstated. For men who had fought with discipline and skill across Europe, the discovery was both awe-inspiring and devastating. Janet offered a rare glimpse of abundance, but also a sobering confirmation that Germany's war effort was fundamentally broken. The contrast between captured supplies and the emptiness of German depots made the collapse tangible, immediate, and undeniable. Soldiers who understood the implications felt a mixture of relief and despair, the fleeting joy of fuel tainted by the realization that it could not alter the course of history. The human mind grasped what strategy and technology had already dictated. The Reich was running on borrowed time, and even extraordinary courage could not reverse the tide. In these intertwined angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, and moral, the importance of captured fuel transcended the immediate moment. It became a lens through which the entire war, its failures, and its structural inequities could be seen. For Colonel Richter, standing in the icy morning, the barrels of American gasoline were not merely a resource. They were a revelation, an irrefutable signal that Germany's power had eroded to a point from which there was no return. Each soldier, each vehicle, each strategic decision was now inseparable from the single reality that governed every aspect of the collapsing Wehrmacht. Fuel, or the lack of it, would decide everything. Leadership decisions in the final months of the Third Reich were defined by desperation and disconnection. Hitler's directives remained grandiose, often divorced from the realities on the ground. Orders demanded attacks, counteroffensives, and territorial holds that were impossible to execute without adequate fuel. Frontline commanders like Colonel Richter found themselves navigating a narrow corridor between obedience and practicality. Each decision carried profound consequences. Allocating the captured American fuel to one unit meant denying another. Sending armored vehicles forward could exhaustion. If temporary tactical gains but without continuous supply, those victories were fleeting. Commanders were forced to improvise, yet every improvisation revealed the depth of systemic failure. The Germany's fate rested not on valor or planning, but on logistical scarcity, weighed heavily on those who understood the mechanics of modern warfare. The enemy perspective further amplified this imbalance. Allied forces had turned logistics into an operational weapon. Fuel shipments arrived with clockwork precision, synchronized with infantry advances, armored thrusts, and aerial support. Every American convoy reinforced a front line capable of sustained action, while German units faced the opposite reality. The scale of production made individual captures insignificant. Even if Richter's 50,000 gallons could temporarily power a company of tanks, the Allies could produce and distribute 10 times that amount within days. This disparity reshaped strategy. German officers understood that operational pauses were no longer tactical choices but necessities dictated by scarcity. Every captured depot, every fleeting advantage was a reminder of the structural imbalance that determined the outcome long before bullets were fired. The psychological weight of these circumstances was immense. Soldiers and officers alike had been trained to fight, to maneuver, to anticipate the enemy. Now they faced a silent, pervasive threat: immobility. Frozen roads, abandoned tanks, and empty fuel barrels became symbols of a larger collapse. The colonel, walking among the stacked barrels, recognized the bitter irony. These captured supplies were a gift from the enemy, a temporary lifeline, yet they underscored the insufficiency of Germany's own industrial and logistical planning. Morale, already fragile from months of retreat and attrition, faltered further under the pressure of realization. Every soldier knew the war's outcome was no longer decided on the battlefield alone. It was being determined in factories, in refineries, and in ports thousands of miles away. Technological dependence remained a critical factor. German tanks, half-tracks, and aircraft, while formidable on paper, relied entirely on continuous fuel supplies. Advanced engineering could not compensate for empty tanks or immobilized artillery. Even elite divisions, trained and disciplined, found themselves constrained by mechanical impotence. The captured fuel offered a temporary solution, but it did not restore the fundamental operational capabilities required to influence a campaign. Vehicles once symbols of German military ingenuity now sat dormant, waiting for a resource that was increasingly scarce. Each liter of fuel became a strategic asset, each barrel a fleeting key to temporary mobility. The realization that technology, without supply, was powerless became a daily lesson for officers at all levels. The moral dimension, entwined with psychological strain, revealed itself in small but telling ways. Soldiers debated the best use of the fuel, knowing that their choices reflected not only tactical considerations, but survival. Should it be used to support retreating units, to launch counterattacks, or to evacuate civilians trapped by advancing forces? Every option carried ethical weight and operational consequences. The temporary abundance illuminated Germany's chronic inadequacy, forcing officers and men to confront the limits of their power. For Richter, this moral calculus was stark. Even in possession of enemy resources, the Reich's capacity to sustain war had eroded beyond repair. From a broader strategic lens, the captured fuel illustrated the decisive role of industrial capacity in modern warfare. Germany had invested heavily in blitzkrieg doctrine, in rapid mechanized operations, and in technological innovation. Yet these investments relied on a single fragile underpinning: fuel. Allied strategy had exploited this dependency with devastating efficiency. Bombing campaigns, port seizues, Res and industrial production created a structural advantage that the Wehrmacht could neither match nor recover from. Each captured fuel depot became a mirror reflecting this imbalance, highlighting the futility of local victories against the weight of global production and logistics. Colonel Richter's moment of realization, therefore, was not isolated. It was emblematic of a larger truth facing the German military. Human courage, tactical skill, technological innovation, and leadership decisions all mattered, but their impact was constrained by a single unyielding factor: the availability of fuel. Every angle, every perspective converged on this reality. The captured 50,000 gallons were simultaneously hope and indictment, a temporary lifeline, and a stark reminder of systemic collapse. In that moment, the human mind, trained to evaluate strategy, assess risk, and anticipate enemy moves, confronted the unassailable fact that Germany's power had been reduced to a question of logistics. This clarity, experienced by Richter and echoed across the front lines, set the stage for the decisive turning points to come. It would shape retreats, stall offensives, and determine the outcome of battles that no tactical brilliance could alter. The convergence of human, technological, moral, leadership, and enemy perspectives pointed to a single, unavoidable truth. The Reich was running out of time, resources, and options. Every subsequent action would be measured against this immutable reality, making the approaching climax of Germany's collapse both inevitable and irreversible. January 18, 1945. The morning was bitterly cold, the landscape frozen under a layer of frost that cracked beneath the weight of boots and vehicles. Colonel Richter surveyed the captured depot, barrels of American fuel lined in neat rows, glinting in the dim light. The scale of the find was staggering, yet the colonel knew it could not reverse the course of the war. The Wehrmacht was faltering across all fronts. In the east, the Red Army had crossed the Vistula, advancing into Silesia and Pomerania with a momentum that German forces could no longer check. Entire divisions had been immobilized by fuel shortages, tanks abandoned in the snow, artillery silent for lack of diesel. Orders for counterattacks went unheeded, not for lack of will, but for lack of the simplest resource required to wage modern warfare: gasoline. In the west, The situation was equally dire. American and British forces had reached the Rhine, crossing bridges while German engineers scrambled to destroy them. Panzer divisions intended to launch counteroffensives had stalled months earlier, leaving pockets of German resistance isolated and exposed. Communications were fractured. Supply chains had collapsed under relentless bombing and attrition. Every maneuver, every tactical decision was now constrained by the simple question of whether there was fuel to move a single truck, a single tank. The discovery of the depot highlighted the absurdity of Germany's predicament. There it was, tens of thousands of gallons of gasoline, yet too far from the front lines to change the strategic balance. Richter realized that mobility, the lifeblood of blitzkrieg, had become a liability when resources were scarce. Tanks, once the spearhead of German offensives, sat idle. Columns of trucks meant to reinforce the front were abandoned on snow-covered roads, engines frozen, wheels sunk into mud. Infantry marched on foot, straining under heavy packs, while artillery units waited for diesel that would never come. The contrast with the Allies was stark. American armored units, supplied with near-limitless fuel, moved with coordinated precision, striking weak points and exploiting every hesitation. The Wehrmacht could no longer dictate the tempo of battle. It could only respond, often too late and always under severe constraint. The human cost was immediate. Soldiers, aware of the broader context, grew despondent. Morale, already fragile, collapsed further when the implications became clear. Every abandoned vehicle, every stalled column was a symbol of systemic failure. Officers tried to rally their men, emphasizing discipline and duty, but the truth was undeniable. Men understood that they were fighting with half of what they needed, improvising around shortages that commanders could not remedy. Desperation replaced initiative. Fear replaced confidence. The psychological edge that had once defined German forces had evaporated, leaving only the bitter knowledge that survival depended more on circumstance than skill. Operationally, the consequences of fuel scarcity manifested in decisive ways. In Silesia, the 17th Panzer Division had orders to counter the Red Army's push toward Breslau. The division advanced only a few kilometers before grinding to a halt. Tanks were immobilized, trucks ran dry. Infantry tried to continue on foot, but supplies were insufficient. Orders from high command were impossible to execute, leaving the division exposed to encirclement. Similarly, in the west, remnants of the 5th Panzer Army faced a collapse during defensive operations along the Rhine. Commanders attempted to regroup and launch counterattacks, relying on captured fuel depots. Yet the distances involved and the logistical gaps were insurmountable. Temporary surges of mobility could not mask the deeper structural failure. The moment that cemented Richter's understanding of Germany's fate came during a council with other officers. Maps were spread across a makeshift table marked with fuel depots, rail lines, and advancing Allied units. Calculations were grim. Even if every captured barrel of gasoline were deployed strategically, it would barely sustain operations for days, not weeks. Every maneuver, every land counterattack, collapsed under the harsh arithmetic of consumption versus availability. The colonel's hand hovered over a cluster of barrels, the reality sinking in. No amount of bravery or tactical ingenuity could compensate for what Germany lacked most. The war was no longer winnable. This realization shifted priorities. Officers moved from planning offensives to preserving what remained. Retreat became the only viable strategy. Decisions were no longer measured by potential gains, but by survival. Fuel allocations became critical, rationed with precision. Every convoy, every armored vehicle, and every barrel of gasoline was accounted for, yet even this careful management could not forestall disaster. Units were forced to abandon positions, leaving towns, bridges, and equipment to the advancing Allies. The pace of collapse accelerated. For Richter, the captured fuel was both a blessing and a condemnation. It offered temporary mobility and the illusion of control, yet underscored the impossibility of sustaining the German war effort. The human mind grasped what the maps and numbers confirmed. Germany's fate was sealed, dictated not by courage, numbers, or even strategic brilliance, but by the immutable realities of fuel scarcity and industrial imbalance. Every subsequent battle, every retreat and stand would be shaped by this simple, unforgiving truth. The stage was set for the final unraveling. The combination of frozen roads, abandoned vehicles, exhausted troops, and relentless Allied pressure created a scenario from which recovery was impossible. Colonels like Richter understood that this moment, the capture of fuel, the calculation of consumption, the recognition of systemic collapse, was not merely a tactical setback, it was the turning point, the moment when the war had passed beyond Germany's control, leaving only the slow, inexorable path toward defeat. By late January 1945, the operational collapse of German forces had become undeniable. In the east, the Red Army surged across Poland, capturing cities with shocking speed. German units, immobilized by fuel shortages, could offer little more than token resistance. Tanks and half-tracks remained stranded along frozen roads, engines cold, wheels sunk into snow and mud. Supply lines that might have supported counterattacks were shattered. Bridges destroyed, railways bombed, and convoys halted, left entire divisions stranded. Every German officer understood that even local victories were fleeting. The lack of mobility meant no reinforcement, no retreat, no sustained operations. The Wehrmacht's operational capacity had been reduced to a series of desperate temporary measures, each dictated by the availability of gasoline rather than strategy or courage. In the West, American and British forces capitalized on this disparity. Mechanized columns advanced along cleared routes, supplied continuously with fuel, ammunition, and provisions. Tanks and trucks moved in coordinated waves, supported by aircraft that maintained near-constant air superiority. Every German defensive line, no matter how fortified, was vulnerable to this relentless combination of mobility and firepower. Attempts by German commanders to plug gaps with captured fuel were reactive and insufficient. Local counterattacks could briefly regain ground, but the lack of long-term supply meant these gains were ephemeral. Vehicles abandoned after a few miles of movement became symbols of failure, a stark visual reminder of the imbalance between the Allies and Germany. The Ardennes, the last major German offensive in the West, exemplified the deadly consequences of fuel scarcity. During the offensive in December 1944, panzer divisions had advanced rapidly in the opening days, but the pace of progress had been unsustainable. Fuel reserves were exhausted within days, tanks were abandoned, trucks immobilized, and infantry left exposed. Commanders scrambled to reallocate fuel, but the scale of the problem made solutions impossible. By January, the offensive had collapsed entirely. The very vehicles that had been intended to spearhead the attack now littered snow-covered forests, silent and useless. The temporary burst of mobility offered by captured fuel depots could not compensate for systemic shortages, and the consequences were catastrophic. On the Eastern Front, the situation mirrored this disaster. In Silesia, the 17th Panzer Division had orders to halt the Soviet advance toward Breslau. Tanks, artillery, and transport vehicles required fuel to maneuver, yet the division was forced to abandon its positions. Infantry, unsupported by mechanized units, could do little to resist the Red Army's overwhelming numbers. Soviet forces encircled German units, capturing thousands of soldiers. Even the occasional capture of Allied fuel depots could not offset the operational paralysis. German commanders were increasingly forced to make life-and-death decisions dictated by resource scarcity rather than strategy. Retreat became the only viable option, yet even retreat required fuel, which was often unavailable. The human dimension of this collapse was profound. Soldiers who had once fought with skill and determination now faced demoralization on an unprecedented scale. Every immobilized tank, every stalled convoy, and every abandoned village reinforced the knowledge that survival depended more on circumstance than combat ability. Officers like Richter were forced to confront the futility of many decisions. Choices about deployment, attack, or defense were no longer tactical. They were survival calculations. Men understood that even bravery could not overcome immobility. Soldiers marched on foot for me. Isles exposed to freezing temperatures, hunger, and artillery fire, while mechanized units stranded due to fuel shortages offered no support. The psychological toll was immense. Industrial and technological realities compounded the collapse. German tanks, artillery, and trucks, marvels of engineering in previous years, were now liabilities. Engines froze in winter temperatures, heavy vehicles sank into mud, and maintenance became impossible without spare parts and fuel. Even elite divisions, trained for rapid maneuver, were rendered inert by logistical failure. The capture of American fuel offered a momentary lifeline but did not restore operational capability. Technology without energy was powerless. The contrast with Allied forces, which combined advanced engineering with uninterrupted fuel supply, emphasized the disparity starkly. By the end of January, the cumulative effect of these shortages was unmistakable. German forces were retreating on all fronts, defensive lines collapsing, and pockets of resistance becoming isolated. Every captured fuel depot, every improvisation, and every temporary success highlighted the systemic weaknesses of the Reich. Operational collapse was no longer theoretical, it was tangible. visible across the battlefields of Europe. Abandoned tanks, frozen vehicles, and stalled infantry columns became the defining images of Germany's final months. Colonel Richter, standing among the captured 50,000 gallons of fuel, saw the broader implications clearly. The moment of revelation, the recognition that no amount of local ingenuity could offset strategic failure, was complete. Every decision, every deployment, every offensive was constrained by scarcity. The war was no longer about strategy, technology, or even courage. It was about logistics. The Allies' industrial capacity, combined with relentless supply chains, had imposed an unassailable advantage. The Reich's inability to sustain movement meant that defeat was inevitable. In this convergence of operational paralysis, human despair, and technological impotence, the turning point of Germany's collapse became undeniable. Fuel scarcity dictated every subsequent action. Retreats were uncoordinated and desperate, offensives were futile, and the Wehrmacht's once formidable presence in Europe had been reduced to scattered, immobilized remnants. The war had passed beyond German control, and the frozen fields where Richter first saw the captured fuel symbolized the larger truth. The Reich's defeat was no longer avoidable. Every subsequent battle would confirm it, and every lost mile of territory would reflect the immutable reality that Germany's fate had been sealed by the simple, unforgiving calculus of supply and fuel. The aftermath of the fuel crisis and operational collapse in January 1945 was immediate and devastating. German forces, immobilized and overstretched, began to withdraw under pressure from both the east and west. Entire divisions had been rendered ineffective by the inability to move tanks, trucks, and artillery. Soldiers trudged through snow and ice carrying what little supplies they could salvage, while vehicles abandoned on frozen roads became permanent monuments to failure. The captured American fuel, though substantial, could only sustain a fraction of the army for a short period. Its presence emphasized what Germany lacked more than what it had gained. Each liter consumed offered a temporary reprieve, but also a bitter reminder that the Wehrmacht's operational capacity was evaporating. Commanders facing the impossibility of replenishing reserves were forced into reactive strategies, prioritizing retreats and defensive positions over any semblance of offensive capability. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army's advance accelerated. Soviet forces, supplied by an unbroken network of railways and logistics, moved swiftly into Silesia, Upper Silesia, and Pomerania. German units, unable to coordinate due to fuel shortages and destroyed communications, were encircled and captured in large numbers. Cities like Breslau became isolated pockets, defended with diminishing forces and limited mobility. Soldiers were trapped, facing harsh winter conditions, artillery bombardments, and constant aerial attacks. The collapse of mechanized divisions meant that infantry alone could not hold territory against superior numbers and mobility. Even elite units previously capable of counterattacks were reduced to static defensive positions. Fuel scarcity had converted Germany's most powerful weapon, its ability to maneuver, into a liability, leaving the Wehrmacht vulnerable to systematic destruction. In the West, American and British forces exploited the gap with relentless precision. Mechanized columns moved across cleared roads, reinforced by endless convoys of fuel, ammunition, and provisions. German defenses, dependent on captured resources, crumbled in the face of continuous, mobile attacks. The Ardennes, once the site of Germany's final offensive gamble, had become a case study in the consequences of logistical failure. Units that had advanced in December 1944 were now scattered, abandoned, or destroyed. Every captured fuel depot was consumed quickly, unable to sustain operational tempo. Commanders realized that local gains were meaningless when they could not be integrated into broader strategic plans. The Allies' uninterrupted supply chains ensured that mobility, the decisive factor in modern warfare, remained in their hands. The human toll was profound. Soldiers who survived the freezing roads, abandoned equipment, and relentless attacks faced the psychological burden of inevitable defeat. Morale plummeted as men understood that even courage and discipline could not overcome systemic failure. Colonels and officers, including Richter, confronted the bitter truth that their orders, however well-intentioned, were constrained by the harsh arithmetic of fuel and industrial capacity. Troops witnessed abandoned vehicles, frozen engines, and empty depots, all symbols of a collapsing military structure. For many, the war had become a struggle for survival rather than victory, a series of marches, retreats, and improvisations dictated by scarcity rather than strategy. Reports from the front confirmed the scale of the collapse. German high command acknowledged widespread immobilization of units across both fronts. The loss of operational mobility led directly to the encirclement of entire divisions, the surrender of thousands of soldiers, and the abandonment of strategic positions. Cities and towns were evacuated hastily. Equipment left behind often fell intact into Allied hands. The captured fuel that had inspired momentary hope only underscored the stark imbalance. The Wehrmacht could not convert temporary windfalls into strategic advantage. Allied forces reported abandoned vehicles in large numbers, a clear sign of systemic paralysis. The scale of these losses marked a turning point in the European war, ensuring that no future offensive could change the outcome. Strategically, the consequences were even broader. The collapse in operational capability accelerated the overall defeat of Germany. Without fuel, mechanized divisions could not counter advancing Allied columns. Supply lines could not be maintained, and any attempt at offensive operations was doomed to fail. High command directives demanding action regardless of resources resulted in wasted manpower and material. Each lost kilometer of territory, each abandoned vehicle, and each surrender reflected the larger reality. Germany's fate was no longer determined by planning or courage, but by the immutable constraints of logistics. The contrast with Allied operations, where supply lines were robust and mobility maintained, highlighted the decisive role of industrial capacity and resource management in modern warfare. In this aftermath, Colonel Richter's realization took on deeper significance. The captured 50,000 gallons of fuel, once a symbol of hope, became a measure of systemic failure. It illustrated the extent to which Germany relied on temporary fixes rather than sustainable supply. It highlighted the gap between the Reich and the Allies in production, logistics, and operational endurance. And it revealed the human and technological limitations imposed by scarcity. The war was no longer a contest of tactics, leadership, or skill. It was a war dictated by resources. Every abandoned tank, every stalled convoy, and every retreat underscored this fundamental truth, setting the stage for Germany's final collapse and the end of the Third Reich. By February 1945, the full scale of Germany's collapse was visible across the European battlefield. Fuel shortages had immobilized entire divisions, leaving troops exposed to advancing Allied forces. Abandoned tanks, trucks, and artillery littered roads and fields, silent testimony to the Reich's logistical failure. Cities once defended by coordinated mechanized units now fell easily, as infantry alone could not withstand sustained attacks. Civilians and soldiers alike watched the German army shrink into scattered pockets, unable to mount coordinated resistance. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of soldiers captured, wounded, or killed due to the inability to maneuver, resupply, or retreat effectively. Reports from the front indicated that even well-trained and experienced units were reduced to vulnerable, static targets, their fighting potential erased by the absence of fuel. In the West, Allied forces continued to exploit their operational mobility. Mechanized divisions advanced rapidly across Germany, seizing key towns, bridges, and road networks. Supply convoys kept units fueled, armed, and provisioned for continuous movement. The contrast with German forces could not have been sharper. While the Wehrmacht struggled to move a single panzer across snow-laden roads, Allied columns pushed forward with tanks, artillery, and trucks operating at full capacity. Even when German soldiers attempted localized resistance using captured fuel, their efforts were temporary and largely symbolic. The inability to sustain operations meant that tactical victories could not be expanded into strategic advantage, reinforcing the inevitable trajectory of defeat. On the Eastern Front, Soviet advances intensified. Cities like Breslau, Thorn, and Danzig became surrounded, with German garrisons cut off from supplies. Fuel shortages compounded the challenges of winter warfare, leaving infantry without transport and artillery without mobility. The Red Army exploited every weakness, encircling and capturing German formations that had been rendered immobile by the lack of gasoline and diesel. German commanders attempted desperate reallocations of resources, but these measures only delayed the inevitable. Every captured depot, every temporary fuel windfall, highlighted the gap between potential and reality. Operational paralysis defined the final weeks of German resistance, transforming once formidable units into stationary targets for coordinated Allied offensives. The destruction wrought by these shortages was immense. Abandoned vehicles and equipment fell into Allied hands, providing both material gain and a psychological blow to German forces. Fuel depots left behind were consumed, yet the quantities were insufficient to restore mobility or sustain prolonged combat. The once feared German mechanized force became a series of inert symbols, incapable of influencing outcomes. Soldiers on both fronts, experienced the consequences firsthand. Frostbitten infantry trudging through snow, artillery unable to reposition, and commanders forced to choose between untenable options. The loss of fuel transformed operational challenges into existential crises for units already strained by attrition and harsh winter conditions. Numbers illustrate the scale of collapse. Thousands of vehicles were abandoned, entire panzer divisions rendered ineffective, and supply columns immobilized. Tens of thousands of soldiers were encircled and captured. Even well-trained units equipped with the most advanced weapons of the war were neutralized by logistical deficiency. The captured fuel, while momentarily sustaining small groups, could not alter the broader course of the war. Every liter consumed was a fleeting reprieve in a conflict already dominated by resource disparities and industrial imbalance. Reports from German high command acknowledged these failures, yet there was little that could be done. The Reich's industrial and logistical foundations had been shattered, and no temporary windfall could restore them. Strategically, the consequences rippled across the entire European theater. German retreats accelerated and defensive lines collapsed under sustained Allied pressure. Operational planning shifted from offensive action to survival, from maneuvers to withdrawals, from victories to minimizing losses. Commanders who once coordinated large-scale campaigns now focused on extracting their units from encirclement, conserving remaining fuel, and preventing total annihilation. The psychological impact on soldiers was profound. Morale, already weakened by repeated retreats, crumbled further as the scope of systemic failure became undeniable. Every abandoned vehicle and every empty depot symbolized not just tactical loss, but strategic inevitability. For Colonel Richter, the aftermath confirmed at what the captured fuel had revealed. Germany's defeat was no longer preventable. The Wehrmacht had lost its mobility, its operational freedom, and its capacity to influence the battlefield. Every subsequent battle, retreat, or attempted counterattack was dictated not by strategy or courage, but by scarcity. The Allies' logistical superiority had rendered local improvisations irrelevant. Fuel, once a mundane resource, had become the decisive factor in the outcome of the war. The frozen depots, abandoned vehicles, and immobilized units stood as permanent reminders that industrial capacity and supply chains now dictated victory, relegating tactics and bravery to secondary importance. In the wake of January and February 1945, the Third Reich's military power had been reduced to a fragile, reactive force. The capture of American fuel, once a rare boon, underscored the impossibility of sustaining a mechanized army without reliable supply. Operational collapse, human suffering, and systemic failure converged to create a landscape in which defeat was inevitable. The Wehrmacht could no longer control its fate. Every abandoned tank, stalled convoy, and retreating soldier illustrated the simple, immutable truth. Germany had run out of time, resources, and options. This naturally leads into the reflection/closure, which will provide a calm, philosophical ending, tying together the human, technological, and historical significance. The story of Colonel Richter and the captured 50,000 gallons of American fuel is more than a moment in military history. It is a lens through which the true nature of modern warfare becomes clear. Wars are often remembered for battles, leaders, or heroism, yet the outcome of the conflict in Europe was shaped as much by logistics, production, and fuel as by strategy or courage. The Reich, once capable of sweeping advances and rapid maneuvers, was undone by the absence of the most basic resource needed to power its machines. Tanks sat frozen, trucks idle, artillery immobile, all because the arteries of supply had failed. Mobility, the hallmark of German military power, became a measure of collapse. The captured fuel symbolized both hope and inevitability. For Richter and his men, it offered a fleeting chance to act, to maneuver, to reclaim a small fragment of control in a rapidly disintegrating front. Yet that same fuel revealed the larger truth. No isolated gain could counterbalance the systemic collapse of Germany's industrial and logistical capacity. The human mind, capable of brilliant tactics and improvisation, was powerless in the face of shortages that determined the course of entire campaigns. Courage could not compensate for immobility, and valor alone could not turn the tide when fuel, the lifeblood of modern armies, was absent. History, technology, and human experience converge in this moment. The war had become a contest of resources as much as of strategy, a measure of who could sustain movement, maintain supply, and exploit the operational freedom that only fuel could guarantee. The Allies' success was not simply the result of superior weaponry or planning, but of industrial scale, logistical foresight, and relentless supply. Germany's failure was similarly structural. Brilliant officers and elite troops were constrained by what they could not produce or transport. In the cold winter of 1945, amidst abandoned tanks and frozen roads, the truth became undeniable. The Reich's fate was sealed not in a single battle, not by a single defeat, but by the cumulative consequences of scarcity, immobility, and systemic imbalance. The captured fuel, once a treasure, became a silent witness to the inevitability of defeat. It reminds you that in modern warfare, power is not measured solely in weapons, numbers, or tactics, but in the ability to sustain the fight, to move, to supply, and to endure. The lesson endures. Logistical reality, the quiet arithmetic of fuel and resources, often determines the outcome long before the first shot is fired.